Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today I will be quilting 4 of my little table toppers. I have a big project going on right now and I finished 4, so I thought I'd bring you along and show you how I quilt my small quilts. Let's get started. Here's the first quilt I'm going to start with. I found this pretty black and white fabric for the back, and what I'm going to do first is just use my 505 spray just a tiny bit to keep my layers all together. I'll be putting straight stitches through this quilt following my seams, and so I gave myself a larger stitch length, and I'm just using my all-purpose sewing foot. I know some machines would probably do better with a walking foot, but I used my all-purpose foot and it works just fine. So I followed my seams, and when I got to the outside I just sort of eyeballed that line because the outside border, that small little border there, doesn't exactly correspond with my quilt blocks. So I followed all of the seams from those hourglass blocks and trimmed my little quilt, and now I'll add a binding using binding that's 1 3/4 inch wide. I'm just going to have a single layer of binding. Sometimes when you're making a quilt you do a double layer, but with these small little table mats I like a thinner binding, and I'll take I was able to get a long strip, so first I started by folding that end and sewing over it, but after I was done I realized, I think I'm going to do that invisible binding, I think it's called, where you, well, I'll show you in just a minute. So I went around, and when I got to the corner I stopped before the end about a 1/4 inch, and then I pivot and I sewed off the corner, and then I folded my binding up and down to give myself a fold there, and I went all the way around my quilt just like that. Here's where I decided to make that invisible join with my binding rather than have that fold. Sometimes I do a fold like this. I've done it on other videos, but today I changed my mind and I ripped out some of my stitches so that I have now 2 tails of binding hanging off my little quilt and about an 8 to 10 inch opening there. So what I'll do is I will fold one of those tails, and I need to have at least 1 3/4 inch because that's the size, the width of my binding. So I'm going to fold that left, and that's going to be my longer piece, and then I'm going to trim across the one on the right, and that will be right next to the fold. And now I'm going to double check. I need that little tail there to be 1 3/4 inch. So I trimmed off just that little tiny bit, and then I will put these 2 tails together, right sides together, at an angle, and then I will sew from corner to corner, trim off the triangle, and then it should fit perfectly onto my quilt. Now that my binding is on the front, I'm going to roll it over to the back, tucking that raw edge in. I'll pin all the way around, and then I'll have some handwork to work on in the evening. Here's my octagon quilt. I did add a little border to it after the video I made on how to make it. I got a backing, and then what I'm doing is I'm following the seams of following along the bottom of each of those triangles, the larger side of those triangles. That was my guide. So they kind of crisscrossed across this quilt, and it made a really nice, easy quilt pattern. This kind of quilt pattern is nice because you don't have to mark anything, and it's called a cross hatch pattern. It's sort of squares on point. Then I trimmed my batting and backing off, and then I will be adding binding just exactly the same way with 1 3/4 inch wide strip of fabric. And when I get to these corners, I'll do the same thing. I will fold my binding up and down, but it won't be a 90-degree angle. It'll be a different angle, but it still works just the same way. This time I thought ahead and left myself a tail so that I could do that invisible join again. And here's my corner. I stop about 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then I did another just an angled seam right off the corner. And then you can see that fold is not the same as the other kind, but it still works. I just fold kind of perpendicular to where I am sewing, and when I turn it to the wrong side, when I fold it over to the back, it'll make a nice little fold for my little quilt here. When I got to the end, again, I left myself 2 tails, and I did the same thing as I did the last time, making that invisible join and closing up that hole, folding all of my binding to the back and pinning, and I'll be ready for my next quilt. Now this little quilt, I will be quilting differently. I found this pretty fun fall fabric for this quilt. I put my 3 layers together again with my 505 spray, and with this little quilt I'm going to be doing some free motion quilting with some loop-de-loops, I like to call them. I wanted a thread that would sort of blend in, and I found this taupe color that's kind of, I don't know, a grayish green, and I need to change out my foot on my sewing machine for a free motion foot. So I put my free motion foot on, and I put my feed dogs down, and then I'm going to start doing some loop-de-loops. I'm starting in the middle of my little quilt, and I will fill in that first square with some just curvy lines with some loops here and there. It's a real easy doodle pattern. I think everybody has their own sort of doodle. Just filling in the quilt with some curvy lines. When I was all done with my loop-de-loops, I trimmed the edges and added binding, just like I did the last two quilts. So the three quilts so far are on my table mat playlist that you can access to see how I made these quilt tops. But this next one I did not make. I took 4 orphan blocks that were donated to me and I put them together to create this small quilt. And so this one I do not have the directions for. I'm going to begin quilting with some curvy lines. I thought that's what I would do, and after getting some lines in this quilt, I realized that my tension was not right. I saw on the back that it was a little loose. So what I had to do was I had to unstitch, I had to take out some stitches, and when I went back and started again, I did change my design. But this design is great. It's kind of a no thinking design, just a curvy line, and then over that curvy line you do another curvy line, and they kind of go together real nice. But like I said, I had to rip out these stitches, which wasn't fun, but it is part of quilting. Sometimes you've got to take out some stitches. Here's the way those curvy lines looked before I had to rip them all out, and that design is okay, but I changed my mind. Sometimes I do that, and I decided instead of that I would do some feather stitching. So with this pencil I'm going to give you an idea of what that feather, how to construct that feather. Starting at the bottom, I went all the way to the top and started by going around and just following that line with feathers that fit into that black area. So I started following my pencil line, starting at the bottom. I went all the way to the top, followed my pencil line sort of. I did not need to follow it exactly. And in the rest of the quilt, I did not mark, but I mainly was marking for you. If you can draw that center line and then you have the outside seams to follow, it's pretty easy to eyeball the feathers as you go along. Once I had my black feathers in, I went back with some pink thread and I put some 6-petaled flowers into those squares, just following the square, making larger petals pointing out to the corners, and then I put 2 petals on either side of that, kind of avoiding that seam on the right and left of that flower. Then after I did my little flower, I did some wavy lines from corner to corner on that pink and green section there. As you can see right here on the outside of the quilt, I just did half of a flower just to kind of go along with the flowers in the middle. Now that I have 4 of my little quilts quilted, I can sit down at the end of the day and do some hand stitching on that binding and get them all ready to go. I have 5 more quilts that I need to quilt, and I'll be bringing you along on that adventure very soon, I hope. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.